To bring in Jonathan Swan of Axios, who obviously covers the White House very closely. Jonathan, let me ask you a question that I've asked a lot this week and haven't heard a good answer. What happens if Donald Trump gets that phone call from Wayne LaPierre and just says, screw you, I'm doing universal background checks. I won't go for the assault weapons ban, but I'm not doing background checks, something that, by the way, is supported by your membership, a majority of your membership in the NRA. What's the cost in that to the President of the United States, the most powerful man in the world?
Well, what Donald Trump has been doing this week is what he does every time, which is effectively his way of testing a message is to sort of bite at it, nibble at it, as Heilemann was saying. It's him testing the waters. What's the reaction going to be? Am I getting torn up on Fox News? What's the blowback? So he nibbles, because his instincts are actually that there does need to be stronger background checks. But you're right, he's worried about this. This is one of his most electric issues with the base, and he realized that pretty early on. I mean, he's a New Yorker. He's not, Donald Trump doesn't come from a culture of wanting to, own guns and be sort of hyper Second Amendment. He developed this as a political tactic. He's probably the only politician in America that could actually shift this issue in the Republican Party, because he has such a cult following in the Republican Party, such a hold over that party, that if Donald Trump did come out in favor of a background check position, look, there would be a lot of Republicans that would defy him, but it would be quite hard for a number of others. The only interesting new factor here is that the NRA is in complete disarray. It is an organization roiled by financial malfeasance. It's basically, as one person described to me, Wayne LaPierre and a phone at this point in terms of their internal organization. Now, they've still got a huge grassroots donor base, money, etc. But boy, they've got some problems. And I wonder if that does add a new little element into this conversation.
They've been out shopping for homes for Wayne LaPierre in Dallas and ignoring their membership, maybe. No, well, let me ask you that question then. What happens if Donald Trump says, I'm not listening to you anymore, Wayne LaPierre. You don't have the power you once had, and your own membership is okay with universal background checks. Why can't he just do that? That's not even a bold or brave or risky proposition.
I mean, he sort of has, and to Jonathan's point, you've seen Fox News personalities move towards his position very publicly, but that doesn't move members. I mean, Jonathan, you said earlier that, it would take a Democratic Senate and a Democratic president. Well, that's what we had in 2013, and the Manchin-Toomey bill failed on Democratic votes. The specifics matter. The background checks and increased background checks on private sellers and private individuals wouldn't have captured these killers. Red flag laws might, but that requires a culture of personal responsibility in which individuals take responsibility for the people around them who are exhibiting these kind of behavior patterns that are really disturbing. And when you have an assault weapons ban, whatever that means, assault rifles is a thing, assault weapons isn't a defined thing. And when you have something like a Ruger Mini 14, which does exactly what an AR-15 does, but isn't captured in this bill, but the AR-15 is, it's not effective. The language really matters, and Democrats and Republicans in the legislature who put their names on these bills are going to really care about the substance.
Okay, we're going to continue this conversation in just a minute. Also, Jonathan Swan has some new reporting on tonight's Hamptons fundraiser that's caused so much controversy among patrons of SoulCycle. And we'll talk more about gun violence with Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot, what she hopes to see from Congress and from the White House. But
thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.